Neel E.kearby. Fire and Ice, the race to become first Top Gun. It was late June 1943, and a lone American P-38 Lightning circled leisurely over Amberley Field near Townsville, Australia. In the cockpit was Lieutenant Colonel George Prentice, a solid combat veteran with 2 aerial victories, including one shoot-down 4 months earlier during the critical Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Lieutenant Colonel Prentice had arrived from New Guinea the previous day, where he had flown regular and highly dangerous air missions for nearly a year. At Amberley Field, he was now to assume command of the new 475th Fighter Group. Organized on May 15, it was to be the first 5th Air Force all-P-38 fighter squadron. In the preceding year, the P-38 had proven itself superior in combat, not so much for its sleek design and great maneuverability, which were indeed valuable assets, as for the daring prowess of the young men who flew them. The night before there had been a celebration of sorts to welcome the new commander, and Colonel Prentice had celebrated in style with his men. A little hungover the morning after, as he circled Amberley Field in the clear, early morning skies, the veteran pilot knew he was not at the top of his game. Nonetheless, with a keen eye and a sense of duty born out of his combat experience, Prentice felt confident that he would rise to any challenge. Besides, Amberley Field was 600 miles from New Guinea, where little remained of the once invincible Japanese Air Force. On the ground, scores of American airmen watched the sleek frame of the distinctive twin-engine, twin-tailed, American combat plane as it flew an erratic but confident patrol over Amberley Field. All of them knew that a battle was brewing. Few of them believed that the experienced Lieutenant Colonel Prentice would have anything to fear. For the moment the American fighter pilot was alone, commanding the airspace from an altitude of 12,000 feet where very little could harm him. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a second fighter appeared. Incredibly, the invader was diving from above, instantly, and with deadly precision, in a lethal attack on Colonel Prentice's P-38. Powered by a single, 2,400 horsepower radial engine, and with the added inertia of a 7-ton monster of a fighter plane, the attacker screamed in for the kill at more than 400 miles per hour. 4 large machine guns were mounted on each wing, every one of them ready to fill the doomed P-38 with hundreds of .50 caliber rounds in less than a minute. Looking out his cockpit window, Lieutenant Colonel Prentice cursed his overconfidence, winged over, and tried to shake the barrel-shaped behemoth off his tail. It was too late, the attacking enemy couldn't be shaken. Lieutenant Colonel Prentice, flying his first mission as commander of the 475th Fighter Group, knew he was dead. 20 minutes later, the victorious enemy fighter plane taxied to a stop on the ground at Amberley Field. The canopy opened, and the smiling pilot emerged wearing the uniform of an American airman, with the silver leaf of a lieutenant colonel. Neel Kearby hopped down from the wing of his new P-47 Thunderbolt to exchange handshakes with a slightly humbled P-38 group commander. "Congratulations, Kearby," Colonel Prentice announced good-naturedly. "You shot me down in flames more than once." Then, looking around at the group of fellow pilots who had witnessed the mock combat over Amberley, he announced, "I still think the P-38 is the best fighter we've got, but boys, don't sell the jug short." Perhaps at that moment, the only person happier to hear those words than Neel Kearby was the 2 officers' boss, General George Kenney. But the 5th Air Force commander had little time to gloat in his success before he heard Prentice announce, "I think I'll hit the sack early tonight and get some rest. Neel, what do you say we have another go at it tomorrow?" "I interfered at this point," Kenney wrote later, "and said I didn't want any more of this challenge foolishness by them or anyone else, and for both of them to quit that stuff and tend to their jobs of getting a couple of new fighter groups into the war." No doubt Prentice was disappointed that he would not get a chance to avenge his loss, but he and his boys would have many a rematch with Japanese Zeros during which they would further validate the combat prowess of the Lightning. Kearby accepted the prohibition against additional mock combat gracefully, knowing that at last, he had earned a measure of respect for his own favored P-47 Thunderbolts. Now it was time to teach that same measure of respect to the Japanese. Both commanders parted amicably and with broad smiles. Of the two, Only Lieutenant Colonel E.kearby knew that the entire exhibition had, in fact, been the brainchild of General Kenny himself, and that the 5th Air Force commander had done his best to ensure the desired outcome. Neel E.kearby. Probably the only thing about Neel E.kearby that didn't shout the name Texan was his stature. Unlike the stereotype, tall, rugged, fearless, and filled with attitude, Neel stood only 5 feet 9 inches tall. The rest of him more than adequately fit the mold. Born in the rural North Texas town of Wichita Falls along the Oklahoma border in 1911, Neel was the son of Dr. and Mrs. J.G. E.kearby of Dallas. He grew up in Arlington, a thriving metropolis sandwiched between Dallas and Fort Worth, where he first attended high school, and later North Texas Agricultural College, before transferring to the University of Texas at Austin. He graduated there in 1937, with a degree in business administration. As a boy, E.kearby had always been fascinated with aviation. He earned his first flight by agreeing to wash a neighbor's private plane. But E.kearby's interest was not only in flight but in aerial combat. His boyhood heroes were the pilots of the last Great War, the aces of World War I. He compiled a personal collection of albums featuring the great aviators who had inaugurated aerial warfare, and dreamed of someday being like them. Such dreams compelled him to enlist as a flying cadet after earning his degree, and he received his commission as an Army Air Corps aviator in February 1938. Neel E.kearby was an easily likable man, reserved on the ground but a tiger in the air. From his early days of learning to fly in aged at 6 Army trainers in Texas in 1937, to his tour of duty flying P-39s in Panama during the first year of World War II, Neel E.kearby was known to take his flying seriously and competitively. In the cockpit, he was a skilled airman, cool under pressure, and driven to excel. He was also a keen tactician and a natural leader. By the time E.kearby received orders to depart Panama, and assumed command of the new 348th Fighter Group at Westover Field, Massachusetts, in October 1942, he had risen to the rank of major in fewer than 4 years. P-47 Thunderbolts. Under Major E.kearby, the 348th Fighter Group began training for combat, equipped with the newest advancement in fighter aircraft, the P-47. Built by Seversky Aircraft Corporation, later renamed Republic Aviation, the Thunderbolt was designed specifically for the air war in Europe as an escort fighter for high-altitude bombers. For this reason, maneuverability was sacrificed for greater firepower, heavier armor, greater durability, and a larger engine. The end result was a nearly 7-ton fighter framed within a bulky, barrel-shaped fuselage. The ungainly airplane was quickly renamed the Jug in derision by other pilots who saw it as ugly and unsuitable for combat. To make matters worse, the heavy fighter was very slow taking off, and had a very poor rate of climb. Other pilots joked that if Army engineers built a runway all the way around the planet, Republic Aviation would build an airplane that needed every foot of it to get airborne. Neel E.kearby, the tactician, looked beyond the engineering nightmare that was the P-47, and found a flying arsenal. Featuring 8 forward-firing, heavy 50-caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt was a flying warhead that could dive with impunity into the most fearsome enemy formation and emerge unscathed. The P-47 was designed to withstand a 6-ton impact, making it virtually indestructible. E.kearby continued to acquaint himself with the capabilities of the Thunderbolt, and to train his pilots to take advantage of the aircraft's natural abilities for the high-altitude air war over Germany. By May his men were ready for combat in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, General Kenny's P-38 pilots had been writing an impressive resume for their fast, highly maneuverable Lockheed Lightnings. Outnumbered more than 2-to-1 by the Japanese less than a year earlier, and supplemented primarily by aging and battle-damaged P-39s and P-40s, Kenny's fighter pilots now ruled the skies over eastern New Guinea. A for attack, diver bombers. O for observation airplanes. C for cargo airplanes. G for gliders. CG for cargo gliders. PT for trainers. The 5th Air Force, had played a key role in the highly successful campaign to secure the north side of the Papuan Peninsula and establish air bases east of Lae, then had crushed the Japanese effort to reinforce Lae during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Kenny's 5th Fighter Command was victorious but badly bruised. In March 1943, General Kenny made his first visit to Washington, D.C., since taking command of the 5th Air Force less than a year earlier. A key part of this trip, beyond briefing Hap Arnold and the General Staff on the progress in the Pacific, was to plead for replacement pilots and new aircraft. The 5th Air Force had accomplished what a year earlier was considered impossible, but the toll left the command worn, torn, bleeding, and struggling to keep airplanes in the air. The combat toll had been so extensive it was not unusual for more than half of the aircraft mounted for a mission to be forced to abort, not because of enemy fire, but because of mechanical failure. Kenny quickly learned that among the top Allied war planners, despite his tremendous success in the Southwest Pacific, defeating the Japanese was a war on the back burner. Most Allied efforts were focused on defeating the Axis in Europe. This was not a message Kenny wanted to hear or a decision he would accept. He continued to plead for new pilots and aircraft, and the effort finally paid off. On March 22, less than 10 days before Kenny's return to Port Moresby, Hap Arnold called him to his office. He advised the 5th Air Force commander that he had squeezed everything dry to give him some help. That help was to come in the form of 1 new heavy bombardment group, 2.5 medium bombardment groups, 3 new fighter groups, and, one of those groups will have to be a P-47 group. No one else wants them. Desperate for anything, despite all the negatives he had heard about the P-47, and ignoring his own misgivings about the ungainly jugs, Kenny said he would gladly take anything Hap chose to send. Neel E.kearby, with his wife Virginia. Major E.kearby took a badly needed break from making his squadrons ready for combat in Europe on April 3, 2 days after George Kenny left Washington to return to his own command. That 7-day leave gave E.kearby the opportunity to spend a little time with his children and his beautiful wife Virginia, whom he affectionately called Ginger. When he returned to work on April 9, it was to find something unusual going on. The 348th Fighter Group was being readied for deployment. Within 30 days the group moved to Camp Shanks, New York, to begin their final preparations before leaving for overseas combat. On May 14, both pilots and planes were boarded on the Army transport Henry Gibbons. On May 21, the Henry Gibbons passed through the Panama Canal, and the men aboard, who were headed for war, at last, knew what many had begun to suspect, that the 348th Fighter Group with its P-47 Thunderbolts was not headed for Europe. They were, in fact, the group no one else wanted that Hap Arnold had promised General Kenny. The 348th Fighter Group was headed for war in the Pacific with their unwanted, untested, and oft-derided P-47's Thunderbolts. Lieutenant Colonel Neel E.kearby reported for duty with the 5th Air Force at Brisbane, Australia, on June 20. Meanwhile, his ground crews and crated P-47s continued on to their final destination further north at Townsville. General Kenny recalled meeting E.kearby for the first time quite well. The newly arrived group commander made a solid impression, not only for his resume as a seasoned pilot with 2,000 hours of flight time already on the books, but for his eagerness for combat. From the moment of that first meeting, something clicked between the two men, and they became very close friends. Neel E.kearby's boyhood heroes had been the great aces of World War I, men who admired and hoped to emulate. Perhaps Kenny saw in E.kearby the same fire, ability, and hunger that had marked one of those men. The pilot even Eddie Rickenbacker had proclaimed that the greatest airman of World War I, the unstoppable Frank Luke. Kenny had flown combat in that earlier war, shooting down his first German plane on the same day Luke began his incredible string of aerial victories by bagging 3 balloons in a day on September 15, 1918. Kenny knew well the story of Luke's competitive personality, his daring braggadocio, and the skill as a pilot that had enabled him to accomplish what he proclaimed he would do. In all, Kenny netted 2 confirmed kills in World War I, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his second aerial victory on October 9. Kenny wrote of that introduction. E.kearby, a short, slight, keen-eyed, black-haired Texan about 32, looked like money in the bank to me. About 2 minutes after he had introduced himself, he wanted to know who had the highest scores for shooting down Jap aircraft. You felt that he just wanted to know who he had to beat. In the summer of 1943, General Kenny had plenty of seasoned heroes under his command of whom he could be, and was, justifiably proud. There was Captain George Welch, who had shot down 4 Japanese airplanes at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross. Still knocking down enemy airplanes, Welch scored his 9th victory the day after Kearby reported. Captain Tom Lynch and First Lieutenant Richard Bong were tied at 11 victories each and looked to be poised for many, many more. The previous December, Eddie Rickenbacker himself had visited the 5th Air Force, promising to match Kenny's proffered case of scotch to the 1st Airmen to beat the World War I ace of aces unequaled 26 aerial victories. Kenny had no doubt that one of his young pilots would eventually reach that benchmark, and any one of his 3 veteran aces was capable. But Kenny recognized a difference in the attitude of the young lieutenant colonel before him, who had reported for duty by inquiring who he had to beat for the top spot on the victory list. Though Welch, Lynch, and Bong were each capable of breaking Rickenbacker's record, none of the 3 felt pressured to do so. For them, aerial combat was a daily job of shooting down enemy planes. Theirs was not a race to the top. They were simply doing a job to be done, and they were all 3 very good at doing their jobs. E.kearby, on the other hand, had a hunger in his eyes. It was a drive perhaps fueled by his boyhood adoration of the World War I Top Guns, coupled with the boyhood dream to emulate, and even exceed, the accomplishments of his personal heroes. Beyond the hunger that fueled his intensely competitive spirit, Lieutenant E.kearby had both the skill and tactical prowess to accomplish his goals. Perhaps the only real difference between E.kearby and the great balloon buster Frank Luke was that, while Luke's braggadocio turned off his fellow pilots and relegated him to being a lone wolf, Kearby was an easily likable man. No one, least of all General Kenny, took offense when the 348th Group Commander began to proclaim that he intended to shoot down 50 Jap planes. Of course, before Kenny's newest would-be ace could get started, General Kenny had to get him into combat. That, despite Kearby's eagerness, was no small matter. First and foremost, it would take a month to assemble the crated P-47s at Townsville. Once assembled, the small fuel tanks would limit the range of combat operations, necessitating additional delays until supplemental wing tanks could be manufactured and installed. To further complicate matters, the veteran pilots of the 5th Fighter Command weren't all that confident that the P-47 Thunderbolts were even capable of combat operations. I told Kearby that, regardless of the fact that everyone in the theater was sold on the P-38, if the P-47 could demonstrate just once that it could perform comparably, I believed that the jug, as the kids called it, would be looked upon with more favor. I told him that Lieutenant Colonel George Prentice would arrive that afternoon from New Guinea to take command of the new P-38 group which I had formed, and had started training at our Amberley field. He would probably celebrate a little tonight. I told Neel to keep away from Prentice, go to bed early, and the first thing in the morning to hop over to Amberley in his P-47 and challenge Prentice to a mock combat. E.kearby was not only a good pilot but he had several hundred hours playing time with a P-47 and could do better with it than anyone else. Prentice was an excellent P-38 pilot, but for the sake of my sales argument I hoped he wouldn't be feeling in tip-top form when he accepted Neel's challenge. General George C. Kenny. General Kenny reports. It was this critical situation that led to the early morning of mock combat over Amberley where General Kenny's gamble paid off, resulting in Kearby shooting down Prentice's P-38 several times. Kenny, for his own part, was pleased with the outcome and quick to nix any hopes for a rematch. The single clash between P-38 and P-47 had achieved its necessary goal. In a rematch, with Prentice at the top of his form, the results might be reversed. For the moment it was sufficient to know that at last the Thunderbolts had been accepted, even if still dubiously so, as a part of the combat inventory of the 5th Air Force. The real test would come later when they faced the Japanese in the air. Kenny could only hope that the P-47 would again prove itself a capable fighter, despite its many deficiencies. During the last week of July, Lieutenant Colonel E.kearby began moving his fighter squadron to Port Moresby. Even as they were arriving, E.kearby's competition was growing. On July 26, Lieutenant Bong had his single best day of the war, shooting down 4 enemy planes and earning the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 days later he bagged another, bringing his score to 16. If Dick Bong wasn't counting, Neel E.kearby certainly was. He saw his competition increase at the same time he and his men were relegated to generally uneventful duty at Port Moresby, missions that offered little chance for combat. E.kearby's P-47s were still on a short leash for lack of supplementary wing tanks. Besides that fact, the slow-to-take-off jugs made them well-suited to the defense of Port Moresby. Radar provided up to an hour of advance warning before incoming bogies arrived and, even at their slow climb speed, an hour was ample to get the Thunderbolts in position to meet an incoming Zero or bomber. During the first 2 weeks of August, the Japanese began reinforcing New Guinea by moving hundreds of fighters into airfields West La, on the north coast of the island, in and around Wewak. Kenny responded at mid-month with the most sweeping raids since the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It was during these missions on August 18 that Major Ralph Chelly was shot down while piloting his B-25, earning him a posthumous Medal of Honor. That same day, a new would-be Top Gun with a fire akin that which burned within Neel E.kearby got his first and second, and the third victory. 2 days later the newly arrived Tommy Maguire became an ace in his P-38. Dick Bong missed the action around Wewak in mid-August when the 5th Fighter Command had some of its best hunting. The leading Army ace in the Southwest Pacific had suffered battle damage in a July 28 mission, and his plane was out for repairs. Kenny promoted Bong to captain, and sent him to Australia for R&R while his P-38 was being repaired. In Bong's absence, Tom Lynch took up the slack, shooting down 2 enemies on August 20, and bringing his own total to 14. He scored another victory the following day. While Kenny's Lightnings had a field day in the skies over the Huon Gulf, and around the airfields near Wewak in the latter weeks of August, E.kearby's Thunderbolts continued to fly nondescript missions protection patrols at Port Moresby and Dobadura, and routine convoy escort operations. The one piece of good news in the month came on August 16 when 16 P-47s flying close escort duty for Army transports bound for Marilinen were attacked by a dozen enemy Oscars. Captain Max Weeks and Lieutenant Leonard Layton each scored a victory, the first for the 348th Fighter Group. Lieutenant Layton was himself shot down, and was last seen parachuting into the jungle below. Several months later an Allied patrol found his body, confirming him as the group's first combat casualty. When the month of August ended, Dick Bong was in Australia, Tom Lynch was 2 victories behind Bong with 14 kills, and the rookie Tommy Maguire's tally was up to 7. Lieutenant Colonel Neel E.kearby, who had yet to prove the true value of his P-47s despite the group's 2 victories, was still 50 victories shy of the mark he had set for himself. And for the most part, E.kearby and his pilots were still stuck in convoy escort duty, far from the fertile hunting grounds around Wewak. September 4, 1943. First Blood. After the fall of Buna and Gunna in January, Allied attention focused on routing the last Japanese stronghold at La, near the Huon Gulf. Early in the spring General Kenny established an airfield at Tsili Tsili, just 40 miles from the large and critical port of La. Then, on September 3, he dispatched 23 heavy bombers to unload 84 tons of bombs on La's gun defenses while 9 strafers followed with more than 500 fragmentation bombs, and 3,500 rounds of machine gun fire. It was preparation for the final showdown to at last capture La. The following morning 2 dozen B-24s dropped another 96 tons of bombs on La. Meanwhile, Major General Wooten's 9th Australian Division, departing out of Buna, landed in U.S. Navy LSTs on Hopoi Beach a short distance east of La. The invasion date had been selected based on suitable weather, cloud cover, and fog to keep enemy planes based on nearby New Britain Island from interfering with the landing. Unfortunately, that same weather masked events on the surface of the ocean from the fighter cover flying just above the haze. When the transports neared the beach, enemy shore batteries opened up with a withering fire. Simultaneously, enemy airplanes hidden in the nearby jungle managed to slip in beneath the haze to attack the landing force. LST-473 was approaching the beach with its cargo of Australian infantrymen, tanks, and supplies even as a torrent of deadly shells erupted in the waters around it. The transport continued its course towards the beach, determined to brave the maelstrom. Suddenly one of the Japanese dive bombers came in low and released a torpedo directly into the path of the landing craft. Seaman First Class Johnny David Hutchins glanced quickly to the pilot house to warn the steersman when, in an instant, a bomb shattered LST-473. The explosion killed the steersman and mortally wounded Seaman Hutchins, leaving the barge nearly dead in the water. LST-473 was helpless and the ship, and the men it carried were doomed by the incoming torpedo. With only seconds to react, and with the last vestiges of life vanishing from his battered body, somehow Johnny Hutchins managed to stagger to the wheel and turn the ship clear of the torpedo's path. Then he died, still clinging to the wheel. Around him combat-hardened Australian soldiers who had seen the act were awed by the sheer resolve and determination they had witnessed. They could not forget the smiling, blonde, 21-year-old sailor from Texas who had sacrificed his last ounce of ebbing strength to save their lives. 1 year later at the Sam Houston Coliseum in Houston, Texas, Rear Admiral F.C. Bennett presented Johnny Hutchins' well-deserved Medal of Honor to his mother. Despite the hail of enemy fire from the beach, General Wotton's Rats of Tobruk, so named for their own heroic stand a few years earlier in North Africa, landed together with their tanks and supplies. Before noon the transport convoy began the return trip to Buna, save for Johnny Hutchins and one other transport so damaged that it would only get as far as the port at Morobe. The returning convoy was faced with new dangers when the afternoon sun burned off the haze, exposing the ships to enemy flights out of New Britain. At the airfield at Dobadura near Buna, Lieutenant Colonel E.kearby was unaware that enemy pilots had killed a fellow Texan, but he was well aware that a fight was brewing. Word reached Dobadura that enemy aircraft had been sighted moving into the Morobe, Salamaua, and Finchafen areas, which were near the invasion site at Hopoi Beach. It was the anticipated enemy response to the landing of Australian troops on the doorstep of their fortress at La. Kirby's Thunderbolts began taking off around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, yellow flight from the 342D Squadron, followed by 7 more airplanes of blue and green flights. The last flight of 20 P-47s was led by the group commander himself. Half an hour later Kirby's formation of 4 fighters were 14 miles south of Hopoi Beach, cruising easily at 25,000 feet, when Neel saw what appeared to be 2 fighters, and a flying boat flying close formation miles below. At that distance it was impossible to identify the bogies and Kirby knew if he dove, he would lose precious altitude that would be difficult to recover if the dark blips beyond turned out to be American. Kirby noted the signs of bomber damage around Morobe, and several fires in the water near Cape Ward Hunt, and decided the possibility that the unidentified airplanes were enemy made it worth the risk. With his wingman trailing, he nosed into a steep dive at more than 400 miles per hour, closing the gap in less than a minute. At 2,000 feet Kirby, and Lieutenant George Orr, his wingman, closed to within 300 yards behind and to the left of the 3 aircraft. The large flying boat in the center was a Betty bomber, protected by a Zero, and an Oscar close on each wing. The red orbs of the rising sun confirmed their identity as Japanese. Adrenaline filled every fiber of the would-be super ace at the prospect of his first combat. Perhaps it was buck fever, it was doubtless not by design, that rather than making a nearly sure shot at one plane, E.kearby unleashing his .850 caliber machine guns on 2 enemy at once. Even before Lieutenant Orr could trigger his own guns, the wingman watched in amazement as the Betty bomber exploded. One wing ripped away from one of the escorting fighters, causing it to also plunge into the sea below. Kearby knew he had been lucky. His first victory had been a double punch. Chalk one up for the highly touted increased firepower of the P-47. There could be no more doubts. The P-47s zipped past the flaming, falling debris that had been two enemy planes before they could sight on the third fighter. Struggling against the inertia of their diving 7-ton Thunderbolts, Kearby banked and tried to pursue the now vanishing Oscar. Kearby tried to line up for a third kill, but the Japanese pilot executed a nimble climb, leaving Kearby's sights filled only with blue sky and white clouds. Nearly 30 enemy aircraft were destroyed on September 4th, 6 by the anti-aircraft guns in the convoy, 21 of them by General Kenny's P-38s. Neel Kearby scored the only victories for the 348th Squadron. Kearby also realized that his overeagerness had disrupted what could have been a near-perfect attack, one that would have netted all 3 enemy planes. The keen tactician mentally noted his mistakes, which could not take away from his celebratory mood upon returning towards drone. Not only was he at last in the race for Top Gun, he had demonstrated the soundness of a tactic he had preached to his pilots since they received the first P-47s back in the States. Despite its weight, its clumsiness at low altitudes, and its slow rate of climb, the Thunderbolt could be deadly when tactically deployed. Kearby would leave it to lighter, more nimble fighters to dogfight at low altitudes. Proper use of the Thunderbolt meant free-roving flights at high altitude, where they were designed to fly, and where they could track enemy formations unseen. When the moment came for combat, the Thunderbolt's unequaled diving speed would put its guns within range of destroying that formation, long before the enemy even knew American pilots had spotted them. The battle for La was the focus of the 5th Air Force efforts for nearly 2 weeks. On September 5th, Kenny's bombers continued to pound enemy positions in support of the ground operations. This further including dropping Australian paratroopers into Nadzab west of La. For the Australians, it was their first jump ever. After a last-minute decision to insert them by air, their pre-jump training had consisted of nothing more than brief instructions on how to pull the ripcord that deployed the chutes. The operation was surprisingly successful, and by nightfall Nadzab was in Allied hands. The following day air operations continued with 5th Air Force C-47 transports flying General Vassey's 7th Australian Division into Nadzab. To protect the troop movement, bombers continued to pound enemy fortifications around La, and fighters did their best to keep enemy aircraft out of the battle. Dick Bong, recently returned from Australia, claimed 2 more enemy aircraft shot down. Neither was ever confirmed or added to his score, which is ironic. If Dick Bong claimed he shot something down, it was no exaggeration. The intrepid captain had a reputation, not of padding his score, but of frequently giving credit for his own victories to other pilots. Unfortunately, on returning to Marilinen Airfield, Bong made a difficult crash landing. Though he survived uninjured, he was again temporarily out of action. The ground combat to take La continued unabated, and with great success by the determined Australians in the week following the landings at Hopoi Beach and Nadzab. Air operations, on the other hand, were greatly hampered by a week of poor weather. Towards mid-month the weather began to clear slightly, and increased air combat followed. Neel Kearby's double victory on September 4th brought to 4 the total number of aerial victories for his fighter group. On September 13th, Major Bill Banks and Lieutenant Larry O'Neill each scored while flying routine transport cover, upping the P-47 tally to 6. The following day, while leading a similar mission at 20,000 feet near Nadzab, an unidentified aircraft was spotted about 9:45 a.m. above and to the right of Kearby's formation. When the bogies saw the American planes, it began a desperate race for the clouds, a quick indication to Kearby that it was enemy. Kearby's P-47s were now operating with disposable drop tanks to extend their range. These supplemental fuel cells were normally released only before combat, at which time they were lost forever. Realizing he was still short of drop tanks, Kearby ordered his other pilots not to drop their tanks. Instead, he would drop his own and pursue the enemy alone. It was too late. With an eagerness for combat that Kearby could now identify with, 6 of his 7 pilots had already dropped their tanks to follow their commander into combat. Kearby later learned that the 7th pilot would have dropped his as well, but the mechanism jammed. Kearby got there first, closing in at 300 yards on what he could now identify as a Japanese Dyna. A single, 3-second burst from 8 machine guns sent the enemy plane down in flames, and Kearby had upped his score to 3. It would be his last for the month, indeed the last for a dry spell lasting nearly 30 days. Meanwhile, in that first full month of combat, his Thunderbolt fighter group had claimed 11 confirmed victories, at least another dozen probable but unconfirmed, and with the loss of only 2 of their own. On the day Neel Kearby got his 3rd victory, Tom Lynch became a triple ace. The following day, September 16th, while the Australian forces marched victoriously into La, Lynch scored again. He was now tied at 16 with Dick Bong, who was returning to action. Before Bong pulled back into the lead with his 17th victory on October 2nd, Tommy Maguire had upped his own score to 7, with 2 victories on September 28th. Despite the dry spell for all of them over the following week, things were shaping up to erase any lingering doubts about the combat prowess of the P-47 Thunderbolt. October 11, 1943. The weather over Papua New Guinea improved greatly after the first week in October, and several flights of Kearby's P-47s were busily engaged in routine and uneventful escort cover for transports to Nadzab. The morning sky was clear, and with most of his pilots protecting troop and supply movements, Lieutenant Colonel Kearby believed it might be the perfect moment for a free-roving patrol to seek out enemy aircraft in the Wewak area. In preceding weeks, Kenny's fighters had so dominated the air that it was getting harder and harder for his pilots to find targets and score victories. Kearby had long been a proponent of using his fighters not only defensively, as protection for troop movements, but as offensive tools to freely roam the region, tempting the Japanese to come out and fight. The morning of October 11th seemed the perfect moment to test that strategy. Captain John Moore, as operations officer for the 341st Squadron, was not scheduled for any of that day's missions, and volunteered to fly as Kearby's wingman. Major Raymond Gallagher, who commanded Kearby's 342D Squadron, volunteered to join the 2 men, and Captain Bill Dunham agreed to fly wing for Gallagher. Thus were the circumstances that saw the group's ranking officers depart Wardstrom at 9:30 a.m. for a flight Brigadier General Yuzel Nth west to Wewak, while the rest of the group's pilots were tending to their mundane patrols around Nasdaq. Cruising west at 28,000 feet, by 11 o'clock Kearby's flight of 4 Thunderbolts had a clear, panoramic view of the Wewak area 50 miles ahead and 5 miles below. Kearby instructed his pilots to drop their wing tanks and prepare for action. With fuel now limited, he hoped that the enemy would rise quickly to the bait. In fact, the enemy had already risen to the bait. Lieutenant Colonel Tamiya Teranishi, commander of the Japanese 14th Fighter/Bomber Group, was visiting Wewak when radar picked up the incoming Thunderbolts from 50 miles out. He ordered numerous fighters airborne from their fields in the vicinity, then climbed in an Oscar himself and took off to lead the intercepting force. Once rendezvoused with the other fighters he had called into action, his flight would number more than 24 armed fighters, nimble Oscars and deadly Tonys. At 11:15 Lieutenant Colonel Kearby became aware of a lone plane more than a mile below him and off to the left. The Jap plane apparently could not see the incoming Thunderbolts, which were flying east to west out of the sun. There was no evasive action by the enemy pilot. Kearby went into a screaming dive, closing in to positively identify the lone airplane as Japanese by the bright, red meatballs on its wings. Kearby opening fire when he had closed to within 300 yards. The devastating fire tore holes in metal and ruptured the fuel tanks, sending the Oscar and surprised pilot plummeting earthward like a flaming comet. Post-war Japanese reports of the October 11th combat action indicated that the last communication the fighters rushing to join Lieutenant Colonel Teranishi in the air received from their commander came at 11:25 a.m. E.kearby had not only claimed his fourth victory, but most probably was responsible for the death of a Japanese hero and group commander. Kirby's trailing thunderbolts had nothing left to shoot at as they passed through the trailing smoke of Teranishi's falling Oscar, moments behind their leader. Then Major Gallagher spotted a lone fighter off the coast, a few miles out to sea, and heading towards Wewak. Diverting from his three comrades, he sped off alone to try and claim what would be his first victory. The enemy fighter spotted the incoming thunderbolt moments before Gallagher reached combat range, and wisely ducked into a nearby cloud. Disappointed, Gallagher headed back towards the island to rejoin his comrades. Below he saw nothing but jungle, to the right and left he could see nothing but blue sky. He had spent too much time chasing the elusive enemy fighter, and now was far behind Kirby and the two other American pilots. It was a cruel turn of luck, for even at that moment the ranking officers of the 348th Fighter Group were about to engage in the fight of their lives, and an historic one at that. After shooting down the Oscar, Kirby led his formation back up to 26,000 feet for one final pass over Wewak. There were no more planes in sight, including Major Gallagher's, so he planned to make one final sweep and then head for home. Kirby assumed they would rendezvous with Gallagher en route. Any mission where a flight got even a single victory without losing one of their own was a successful mission, and Kirby would not lament the lack of additional targets, or make the deadly error of staying too long and running out of gas on the way home. The mission appeared to be complete when he heard Captain Dunham's voice over the radio announcing, "We've got bogies coming in from the coast, lots of them." "I see them," Captain Moore answered back. "I count about a dozen of them, maybe more. Mostly Tonys I think, with a few Zeeks and Oscars." Kirby looked off in the distance towards the enemy field at Borum, and it was hard to miss the large formation of fighters, cruising at 15,000 feet 2 miles below. A quick count revealed more than a dozen of them. Undoubtedly, they were the aircraft that had scrambled earlier on Lieutenant Colonel Teranishi's alert, and which were now looking for any sign of their silent Japanese commander. None seemed to be aware of the thunderbolts in the distance, and miles above them. For miles out to sea and about 14 miles from the airfield, Kirby saw another flight of at least a dozen Japanese bombers. They were probably returning from a mission, and flying casually home at 5,000 feet. The air was suddenly filled with targets. It was the kind of shooting gallery any hotshot fighter pilot would love to find, unless he was outnumbered at least 8-1 as Kirby and his two other thunderbolts were. "Let's take M," Captain Dunham said eagerly. He had not yet scored his first victory, and Moore had only one. Suddenly, it seemed, they had the whole Japanese Air Force in their sights, and both young officers were itching for a fight. Kirby understood their eagerness, recognized the excitement in their voices, and recalled the moment he had sighted his own first target. He also remembered how, in his adrenaline-soaked eagerness, he had nearly endangered the mission. Kirby the tactician would not make the same mistake twice. Before issuing orders, he reviewed the combat situation that was building, and this time he remained cool and calculating. "Hang on guys. We'll get them, but let's get in position first. Follow me. They don't see us. We're miles above them. This is the moment we've been waiting for, the chance to dive out of the ceiling on an unsuspecting enemy, and tear them apart." At last, after routine missions and luck of the draw air battles limited by the tactic of waiting for enemy fighters to attack, Kirby's thunderbolts had the opportunity to do what they had been designed to do: go on the offense. Kirby moved his flight behind the fighters, leveling off 8,000 feet above them. Still unseen, the P-47s were poised to strike. When they did, the attack came with unstoppable fury, 3 thunderbolts screaming downward, and into the enemy formation at 425 miles per hour. A dozen 50-caliber machine guns spewed lethal, half-inch rounds. Before the enemy pilots even knew they were under attack, the lead Oscar burst into flames, and spiraled into the surf along the New Guinea coast. Neel Kearby had just become an ace. Even as the first victim fell and Kirby turned to attack and destroy his third Oscar of the day, one of the trailing Jap pilots recovered quickly and slipped his arm Tony in on Kirby's tail. Moments before the enemy pilot could unleash his guns on the American flight leader, the Tony itself began to shudder under a withering hail of machine gun bullets. Captain Dunham had been on his commander's wing when the Thunderbolts went into a dive, and had quickly slipped in to cover Kirby's tail. As the enemy formation scattered, there was no time for Dunham to exult in his own first victory. That would come later. The Thunderbolts were now at lower altitudes where their maneuverability could not match that of the remaining enemy planes. The celebration would have to wait. Right now it was time to fight. Captain Moore resisted the urge to dive into the fray. It was hard to watch the ongoing fight and not be a part of it, but, as the trailing aircraft, it was Moore's responsibility to hang back far enough to see everything that was happening, and pounce immediately if another enemy fighter got on Kirby's tail. Mentally he ticked off the tally, 1 for Dunham, 3 now for Kirby, and the unstoppable Texan wasn't ready to let any enemy pilot prematurely lay claim to the title survivor. Even before Dunham's kill hit the ground to explode in the jungle, another Oscar felt the wrath of Kirby's guns, spiraling downward to start its own fire in the foliage below. "My God, 4 of them," Captain Moore said to himself in amazement. "And all in less time than it takes to light a cigarette." Before the enemy could scatter further, Moore finally got a kill of his own. It was his second in 3 weeks, bringing the day's total to 6 for the 3 pilots. And then, with all enemy opposition fading quickly into distant clouds for protection from the man who had shot down 4 of their comrades in mere seconds, Moore executed a series of lazy circles through the area, counting fires and confirming his victory and those of his 2 friends. When the last targets vanished, scattering for safety, Major Gallagher flashed in from the sea. He located his flight leader from the signs of combat, but it was too late to engage the enemy. Below him, both surf and jungle burned with at least half a dozen fires, mute testimony to the great battle that had just taken place. The fight was over and low on fuel, Kirby, Gallagher, and Dunham headed for home. Behind the lead fighters and still out of visual contact, Captain Moore climbed to 16,000 feet to catch up to his 3 comrades. It was 20 miles before he, at last, caught sight of one of the homeward-bound Thunderbolts. It appeared to be alone, 4,000 feet below him and surrounded by a swarm of Jap fighters. Moore saw the P-47 pilot destroy one of the attacking Tonys, but it was obvious the American had bitten off more than he could chew when he had single-handed attacked the formation. Any man that gutsy had to be Kirby, and if it was, then the pilot below him had just destroyed his 5th enemy aircraft, an ace in a day. Diving to the rescue, Moore lined up on the last Tony in a flight of 3. His first burst ruptured oil lines, and the fighter began trailing smoke. A second volley turned the Jap fighter into flaming, molten metal, devoid of an airfoil and dropping like a rock. "Bingo!" he shouted in exuberance. It was his second victory of the day, 3rd so far in the war. Then he looked in his mirror and his celebration turned to horror. The other 2 Tonys were lined up on his tail and closing fast. Almost within firing range, Moore felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck, and dove as hard and fast as his 7-ton fighter would fall. He expected at any moment to feel the wrath of the enemy guns shredding his body. In the distance, Neel E.kearby saw Moore's desperate dive, and was amazed that the 2 Tonys were keeping pace. For all its diving inertia, the Thunderbolt couldn't shake the 2 Jap fighters intent on salvaging some honor from this day of battle. E.kearby was extremely low on fuel and ammunition, but it wouldn't stop him. Winging over, he put his own airplane into a desperate dive, coming up quickly on the last of the 2 Tonys in pursuit of his wingman. E.kearby was still 1,000 yards out, well beyond the range for even the best aerial gunners, but he couldn't wait any longer. It was now or never. He triggered his guns, feeling his downward motion braked by the recoil of the 8 huge 50s, throwing him forward to strain against his shoulder harness. The guns on one wing chattered to a halt, out of ammunition and threatening to skew his forward momentum against the unequal force. Kearby fought the controls to stay in line with the enemy while the remaining guns nearly cut Tony into two pieces. Diving through the exploding shrapnel, he continued to fire, unsure if his bullets were striking the last attacker. Winging over, he came in from the 10 o'clock position for a final pass at it, but the angle seemed wrong. Kearby was pretty certain he hit the Tony, thought he saw smoke trailing from what would be his 7th victory of the day. Whatever the case, whether falling in death or retreating in utter fear, the last fighter vanished, and Kearby couldn't stick around to confirm his final kill. Slipping alongside his wingman, the two victorious pilots headed for home. The fact that La was now in Allied hands may have been the only thing that got all 4 men home safely. With an average of 50 to 75 gallons of fuel remaining, they would have had difficulty reaching Marilinen or Dobedura. After landing and refueling at La, the 4 officers flew up and over the Owen Stanley Range to land at Port Moresby. Before leveling off to land, each man took the time to fly over and perform the traditional victory rolls. Captain Dunham made 1 roll, Captain Moore 2 rolls, and Lieutenant Colonel Neel Kearby an unprecedented 7 rolls. After taxiing to a stop, Kearby reported to General Kenny, who at the moment was engaged in a planning session with General MacArthur, who had flown in the previous day. After hearing Kearby's report of the mission, Kenny advised MacArthur, the record number of official victories in a single fight so far is 5, credited to one of the Navy pilots, and he was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor for the action. As soon as I can get witnesses' statements from the other 3 pilots, and see the combat camera gun pictures, if Kearby got 5 or more, I want to recommend him for the same decoration. General MacArthur advised Kenny that if Kearby's tally was verified, he would approve the recommendation and forward it to Washington. Both top commanders extended hearty congratulations to Kearby for his unprecedented, historic one-day combat action. By the time of Neel Kearby's great air battle over Wewak, a total of 16 Army airmen had earned medals of honor, 8 of which had already been presented. All 16 of these heroes, however, had been bomber pilots or crewmen, with the exception of Hamilton and Craw, who received their awards for actions on the ground. By the fall of 1943, the U.S. Navy had fighter pilot heroes like Butch O'Hare and John Powers, both of whom were dead or missing. The Marine Corps had posthumously honored the heroism of fighter pilot Henry Elrod at Wake Island in the opening weeks of the war, as well as other fighter pilot heroes like Richard Fleming. The Cactus Air Force, flying out of Guadalcanal, had produced a number of Marine Corps aces, several of whom earned medals of honor in the fall and winter of 1942. One of them, Joe Foss, had tied Eddie Rickenbacker's record 26 victories before being sent home to receive the Medal of Honor. In fact, during World War II only 3 Medal of Honor heroes had the distinction of appearing on the cover of Life magazine. 2 of them were Marine fighter pilots who had battled at Guadalcanal in the early days of the war, John L. Smith and Joe Foss. The other, in 1945, was Audie Murphy. The Army Air Force was certainly not without heroes of its own, from Buzz Wagner to Richard Bong, whose tally was up to 17. But for whatever reason, nearly 2 years into the war and with hundreds of Japanese planes overgrown in ruin on the jungle floor, or resting at the bottom of the ocean, not a single Army Air Force fighter pilot had yet earned the Medal of Honor. Furthermore, though Kearby's unofficial tally of 7 victories in a single battle was the greatest single-day effort in 5th Air Force history, it was not unprecedented. Nearly a year earlier, on October 26, 1942, Navy pilot Stanley Swedvich-Tasa had shot down 7 Japanese planes in defense of the USS Hornet and Enterprise during the Battle of Santa Cruz. 2 days before Kearby's historic air battle, one of his closest friends from his days stateside, Major Bill Leverett, shot down 7 enemy aircraft in a single battle in the Mediterranean. Neither of those 2 super aces received the Medal of Honor. From a historical standpoint, there are some who look at Neel Kearby and compare him to leading aces of his day like Bong and Lynch, or the air hero of the day of infamy George Welch. Some will quickly point out that Kearby's Medal of Honor nomination was a result of his close friendship with General Kenny. Certainly, from the day Kenny met the cool-as-ice fighter pilot from Texas and saw the hunger in his eyes, Kirby earned something akin to a favored son status with the 5th Air Force commander. That relationship blossomed, perhaps, because General Kenny saw in Kirby a ghost from his own past. The personality and abilities of a World War I pilot hadn't been afraid to set goals for himself, and then used his aerial prowess to make believers out of anyone who doubted him, until the day of his untimely death. Whatever the motivation, E.kearby's action on October 11th, though not unprecedented, was a new benchmark in the 5th Air Force. Ultimately, only 6 of his victories over Wewak were confirmed. The 7th, if indeed it had been a legitimate shoot-down, had come late in the action when all 4 pilots were attempting to break free and head for home. The gun cameras confirmed Kirby's first 6 victories beyond doubt. The film, however, ran out just as Neel's bullets began to strike his 7th target. Kenny recalled, "I wrathfully wanted to know why the photographic people hadn't loaded enough film, but they apologetically explained that this was the first time anyone had ever used that much film. They hadn't realized that enough film to record 7 separate victories was necessary, but, from now on, they would see that Kirby had enough for 10 nips." The true value of Kirby's accomplishment was not reflected, however, in the 6 victories he was officially credited with. Rather, it was reflected best in the after-action report written by 342d Fighter Squadron Intelligence Officer, First Lieutenant Bernhard Roth. A total of 9 enemy fighters destroyed without a scratch on a single Thunderbolt demonstrates that this type of plane has come into its own in this theater, and that its terrific speed both in the dive and straightaway, its flashing aileron roll, and murderous firepower will henceforth strike terror into the hearts of the little yellow airmen. In conclusion, it should be noted that this plane flew well over 300 miles, fought for 1 hour, and returned, the whole mission consuming about 3 hours and 1/2. About 3,500 rounds of ammunition were expended and over 100 feet of film taken. On January 23, 1944, Colonel E.kearby received his Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur in his office in Brisbane, Australia. Kenny recalled, "The general did the thing upright and so overwhelmed Neel that he wanted to go right back to New Guinea and knock down some more Japs to prove that he was as good as MacArthur had said he was." On the day Colonel Kirby became the first Army Air Force fighter pilot to receive his country's highest honor in World War II, his score had increased to 21 victories. More importantly, in 5 months of combat Kirby's Thunderbolts had knocked down an incredible total of 164 enemy planes, confirmed, and scores more that were probable but unverified victories. The value of the once derided Thunderbolt would never again be questioned. It would emerge one of the greatest pursuit airplanes of World War II, legendary in as an accomplishment and exceeded perhaps, only by the legend of the man who led them. At the same time General Kenny submitted his report verifying Kirby's 6 single-day victories in support of a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. Kirby was promoted to colonel. In the weeks that followed Neel pushed himself, not only to try and catch the elusive Dick Bong but to achieve his personal goal of 50 aerial victories. 5 days after his big day over Wewak, Kirby upped his score to 10. He brought it to a dozen with a double victory on October 19th. In addition to the promotion, and during the months before his Medal of Honor was approved, Kirby was decorated again and again. In all, the driven fighter pilot earned 2 Silver Stars, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 5 Air Medals. On October 29th Dick Bong returned to action, adding 2 more victories to his own score. On November 5th, a second consecutive double-punch victory brought the leading 5th Air Force aces total to 21. Kirby, at that time, remained at a dozen. General Kenny had promised Bong a leave to return home when he reached 20 victories, and Dick Bong wasn't hesitant to accept the offer. In December Bong departed for the quiet life of Wisconsin, or at least as quiet a life as his newfound fame would allow. For Kirby, it was the opportunity to catch up. He wasted no time getting to work. General Kenny had reassigned Kirby to the 5th Fighter Command, a position that left him free to fly and to roam all areas of operations at will. It was Kirby's opportunity to at last engage in the kind of unrestricted, offensive combat he had yearned for since his arrival 6 months earlier. On December 3 Kirby had his best day since the October 11th battle, destroying 3 Zeeks 20 miles northwest of Wewak. Single victories on December 22 and 23 increased his score to 17. On January 3 a double victory put him at 19, and another double victory on January 9 brought the total to 21. Kearby and Bong were tied on January 23 when MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on Colonel Kearby's chest. General Kenny did attempt to slow Kearby down, fearful that the intense drive that pushed the young pilot nearly beyond reason would ultimately become his downfall. More and more he tried to keep Colonel Kearby occupied with administrative duties, but there was no keeping the man who wanted to be the greatest fighter pilot of all time out of the air. Kenny noted the difference between the personalities of Kearby and Bong when he wrote his memoirs after the war. "I told Kearby not to engage in a race with that little Norwegian lad. Bong didn't care who was a high man. He would never be in a race, and I didn't want Kearby to press his luck and take too many chances for the sake of having his name first on the scoreboard. I told him to be satisfied from now on to dive through a Jap formation, shoot one plane down, and come on home. In that way he would live forever, but if he kept coming back to get the second one and the third one he would be asking for trouble." Kearby agreed that it was good advice, but that he would like to get an even 50 before he went home. "I said I wished he would try to settle for one nip per week." Colonel Kearby would have been wise to heed Kenny's advice, but with his status as the hottest gun in the Pacific, Neel felt personal pressure to live up to his reputation. Throughout the month of February, it was as if he was flying with abandon, setting the standard for the younger pilots to follow, while striving to attain the standards he had set for himself. Kearby was a celebrity among his men, in the newspapers back home, even to other up-and-coming celebrities like John Wayne who visited the theater on a goodwill tour. Neel Kearby was determined to be worthy of that celebrity status. By this point in time in early 1944, the 5th Fighter Command had 19 squadrons, 11 of which were equipped with the hottest fighter in the Pacific, P-47 Thunderbolts. Seldom were they any longer called Jugs. Colonel Kearby's leadership skills were becoming increasingly more important than his personal combat skills, especially with the infusion of new pilots. The squadrons of the 348th Fighter Group were now led by seasoned, combat veterans. The pilots themselves continued to rack up an impressive record of victories, including one young pilot named George Davis who by February had 2 victories and would go on to become an ace among Kearby's Thunderbolts, then repeat the feat a few years later in Korea where he would earn a posthumous Medal of Honor. Such administrative and training responsibilities aside, when Dick Bong returned and was assigned to 5th Fighter Command on the same freelance status as Neel Kearby, the pressure on Neel mounted. Bong wasn't threatened by the existing tie between Kearby and himself. In fact, had the two men flown together and attacked the same aircraft at the same time, Bong would never have argued the point, he would simply have allowed Kearby the credit. This was the difference in their personalities. Bong was having fun. Kearby was pushing himself to prove something. Jap fighters were becoming more and more scarce as the 5th Fighter Command took control of the sky, and Kearby was finding fewer and fewer potential targets. Time and again during the month of February he flew with various groups, hoping to get lucky. On the rare occasions when enemy fighters were found, the best Kearby could claim was probable here and there. None were confirmed. Bong's fun in the air put him back in the lead with a victory on February 15th. When Tommy Lynch returned from R&R, he too was assigned to 5th Fighter Command under the same free-to-roam status. In fact, Lynch and Bong began flying missions together, 2 of the 3 top Pacific aces hunting together and covering each other's tail. On one such joint incursion into enemy territory near Taji on March 3, each of them scored twice. After that double victory, the scoreboard read: March 5, 1944. Dick Bong and Tom Lynch were out hunting together again early on the morning of March 5. The day was quiet enough and there was no action to be found. The two men were nearing Dagwa, southeast of Wewak, at about 1:30 in the afternoon. The two aces, at last, found a lone Oscar and, within minutes, Tom Lynch had closed to within 1 victory of Kearby. Frustrated with his own lack of success, and realizing that Bong was within 2 victories of tying Rickenbacker and 3 of becoming the first pilot to exceed the World War I Ace of Aces record, Kearby was feeling the pressure to act quickly. It is important to note that the pressure was purely self-induced, heaped upon the man's mind only by his own personal drive to be the very best. Everyone else, from General Kenny to Kearby's closest friends, had done their best to rein him in and talk him out of continuing his fearless, headlong dives into enemy formations. It seemed that Kearby felt invulnerable in his mighty thunderbolt. The other pilots who admired the brash and skillful Texan feared that he wasn't, despite the aura of strength, determination, and near superhuman ability that surrounded him. Perhaps encouraged by the fact that Lynch had managed to find an enemy Oscar in the Wewak area, and certainly pressured by the fact that not only might Bong beat him to Rickenbacker's benchmark but that Lynch was quickly moving towards the second place, Kearby had to get airborne. According to some reports, Kearby's legendary airplane Fiery Ginger 4 was down for repair and the unrestrainable airman borrowed another Peak 47. To this day there remains some controversy as to what plane Neel Kearby was flying on that fateful, last mission. More recent investigations tend to support the idea that Kearby actually flew his last mission in Fiery Ginger 4, his famous Peak 47. Kearby induced Major Sam Blair and Captain Bill Dunham to follow him in a late afternoon sweep over Wewak. Kearby led them into the air at 4:30 in the afternoon and headed east, where 2 days earlier Bong and Lynch had each scored twice. 50 minutes later, en route to Taji, Kearby was patrolling the coastline near Wewak from an altitude of 22,000 feet when he spotted a lone Tony approaching the Dagwa airstrip. Positioning himself for the kind of dive that had repeatedly granted him victory over the enemy, Kearby felt his excitement turn to disappointment when the Tony leveled off to land. The enemy pilot would be on the ground before the American ace could get within firing range, and the only kills that counted on the scoreboard were aerial victories, not airplanes destroyed on the ground. Kearby and his 2 wingmen continued their patrol, hoping to salvage something from the mission before the shadows of dusk crept over the jungle. Suddenly Dunham's voice crackled over the radio. "There they are, I make out 3 of them, coming in low." "I see them," Kearby announced. "Nice little V formation. Drop your tanks guys, and let's nail them." Glistening orbs of near-empty wing tanks fell away as the 3 Thunderbolts nosed down into a lethal dive. For miles passed in less than a minute, the formidable fighters gaining speed as the gravity sucked them earthward even as mighty engines whined in protest to the extreme speed. The 3 enemies were circling less than 1,000 feet above the jungle floor, apparently planning to land at Dagwa. Before Kearby and his men reached firing range, the Jap pilots saw them coming and scattered. Kearby pointed his nose at the lead fighter, opening fire when the 2 were down to 200 feet above the ground. As he dove past the scene of the initial action hot on the tail of the fighter on the right, Major Blair saw what looked like 2 aircraft burst into flames on his left. While Kearby had been firing on the lead fighter, Dunham was flaming the outside wing of the V formation. Blair stayed on the tail of his own target, opening fire 200 yards out and watching a stream of bullets sending it down in flames. At the extremely low altitude, it took only seconds for the Jap fighter to explode into a fireball on the jungle floor. Blair banked and climbed quickly to avoid driving his own fighter into the foliage below. Kearby was braking to the right and trying desperately to climb, an Oscar on his tail. The Americans had initially attacked 3 planes, Japanese Neel or Lily bombers. Behind these, there had apparently followed 3 more Versus, each with at least 3 enemy aircraft. Several of them were now on Blair's tail as he dove for the protection of some low-hanging clouds. Before he disappeared into the white mist, he saw Dunham streaking in from the front of Kearby's besieged Thunderbolt, laying a head-on burst into the Oscar that was bent on claiming victory over the second leading army ace in the Pacific. Flashing past his commander as the 2 P-47s crossed in opposite directions, it looked for a moment as if Kearby's canopy was opening. And then the 2 fighters were out of visual range. Dunham continued on to join up with Blair. It was dangerous to remain in the area, but the 2 men circled as they climbed, scanning the distance for their 3rd man. No sign of Kearby's Thunderbolt could be found in the fading twilight. Low on fuel, the two pilots headed home, hoping to find E.kearby waiting for them on the ground. It was not to be. The minutes ticked slowly away while scores of American airmen stood by at the airfield, scanning the darkening horizon and expecting to see a P-47 limping in. It was inconceivable that the indestructible E.kearby was gone. By the time full darkness had fallen over the South Pacific, however, even the most optimistic among the believers had to confront reality: E.kearby was gone. 2 years after the end of World War II, a RAF search party found the wreckage of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt near Peebo, a small village on the northern coast of New Guinea. After inquiring from local natives, the Australians learned that an American airman had parachuted to the ground shortly before his Thunderbolt crashed. Reports varied. Some claimed the airman was dead when he hit the ground, having jumped from an extremely low altitude. Other reports claimed the airman had got caught in the trees and died from gunshot wounds. The natives had stripped the body, then buried him nearby. For 2 years the skull and a few bones recovered by the natives and turned over to the Australians were marked Unknown X-1598 and kept at the American Graves Registration Service Mausoleum in Manila. In 1949 they were at last formally identified as the remains of Colonel E.kearby, the first Army fighter pilot of World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. Colonel E.kearby came home on an Army transport on June 16, 1949. 6 Army colonels flew to Dallas, Texas, to act as pallbearers for the World War II legend whose belated return was little noticed. E.kearby was buried with honors at Hillcrest Memorial Park in Dallas on July 23, 1949. In an ironic twist of fate, over the years that followed, all 3 of Neel and Virginia's children also died in aircraft accidents. The loss of Colonel E.kearby was felt throughout the Army Air Forces. The tragedy was compounded 4 days after Kirby's death when, while on a sweep over Taji, Dick Bong watched in horror as Tommy Lynch parachuted to his death from his flaming P-38. In Washington, D.C., Hap Arnold sent messages to his Air Force commanders in all theaters of operation, questioning whether it was wise to continue to allow leading aces to fly combat. When their loss may become a national calamity, we are getting a rash of aces and we are losing them in many cases because the individual score means more than the squadron score. Perhaps the most rational response was written by the new 8th Air Force commander in England, General Jimmy Doolittle, who had been the first airman of the war to earn his nation's highest honor. He wrote Hap to note, "Inevitably, some heroes develop, for in a large number of officers there are always a few whose capabilities and accomplishments make them outstanding. A combat leader must lead to maintain the excellence of his unit and the respect of his subordinates. Some leaders will therefore inevitably be killed." Deeply saddened by the loss of his close friend Tommy Lynch and the hard-charging E.kearby, Dick Bong managed to emerge from his own grief without self-doubt. Despite the fact that aerial combat had never been a race for him, after a single victory on April 3 and a triple victory 9 days later, Dick Bong became the first airman to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's record with 28 victories. Before his own war ended, the young man from Wisconsin would emerge as the new ace of aces with a total of 40 victories. In many ways, not the least of which was the fact that like his predecessor Dick Bong didn't see himself in a race for first place but simply as an airman doing his job, the young man was a World War II incarnation of the ace of aces of the First World War. During that first war Eddie Rickenbacker had watched a more competent gunner than himself, a man with uncanny skill in the cockpit and a master tactician, drive himself to prove that he was the best fighter pilot in the Army Air Corps. At the time Rickenbacker noted, "Luke will be the greatest pilot that ever flew, if he lives long enough." If then, Dick Bong was the Second War's Eddie Rickenbacker, one might well understand the forces that drove E.kearby by realizing he was World War II's Frank Luke, fearless, skilled, and driven to prove he was the best. For both men, it was that drive that ultimately led to their death. In fairness, it was also that same drive that caused them to indeed be the greatest fighter pilots alive while they lived. Dear viewers, we greatly appreciate your time and support in watching our video. If you found it amusing or instructive, please consider subscribing to our channel. Subscribing not only shows your support for our work, but also allows you to become an active member of our growing YouTube community. In addition to subscribing, remember to enable the notification bell icon. This means you'll be among the first to know when we release new videos. Being a member of our notification squad ensures that you do not miss any great changes or announcements. Your subscription and participation mean everything to us. It encourages us to keep generating high-quality content that entertains, informs, and inspires. We really appreciate each and every one of you for choosing to join our YouTube family. As we travel together, we vow to provide more engaging and insightful content that speaks to your interests. We value your opinions and recommendations, so please share them with us in the comments area. Thank you again for your unwavering support. We're thrilled to have you join us on this trip. Until our next video, take care, stay tuned, and remember that we can all make a difference. See you soon.